Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive into today's chilling story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our history mysteries. Today, we'll uncover the haunting tale of Rebecca Adams, the young woman who never came home after a trip to Alaskan, whose diary was unearthed 8 years later. The year was 1923. Alaska was still a place that felt raw and untamed, where wilderness pressed up against the small settlements people tried to carve from the snow and timber. The railroads were young, the towns were scattered, and in winter, the silence of the land could swallow you whole. It was a time when the frontier still whispered of opportunity, but also of danger, of mysteries that could swallow men and women. Without a trace, Rebecca Adams was 22 years old when she stepped aboard the steamship out of Seattle, bound for Alaska. She had grown up in Montana, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a farmer who had passed away too young. Her life until then had been steady, but quiet, and she had always dreamed of something larger, something that might carry her name beyond the little towns of her childhood. Alaska, with its promise of gold, wilderness, and stories waiting to be told, had captured her imagination. Rebecca wasn't traveling north for riches in the earth. She carried no pickaxe or pan. What she carried instead was a leather-bound diary, a gift from her mother, and a determination to write. She wanted to see the land, to record it, to live in a way that would not be forgotten. Those who saw her on the voyage remembered her clearly. A tall young woman with auburn hair, tucked beneath a wool cap, her eyes set always on the horizon. Some said she kept mostly to herself, writing for hours on end, pausing only to glance out at the vast gray waters of the Pacific. She asked the fishermen questions about storms they had survived, about the feel of the northern seas in winter. She asked the other women on board what had brought them to Alaska, what they feared, what they hoped. People later recalled her smile, her curiosity, and the way she always seemed to be listening for something deeper than the words people gave her. When the ship docked in Seward, Rebecca stepped off with 2 bags. One held clothes, boots, and a few provisions. The other, smaller bag, held only her diary, some pencils, and a few letters. The plan she had told her family was simple. She would travel by train along the Alaska Railroad, stopping in small towns, to write, to see, and to record the lives of those who had made this vast place their home. She promised to return before the next winter, to bring her stories and her diary back to Montana. But Rebecca Adams never came home. Her family waited through that first winter, anxious but hopeful. Letters sometimes took months to arrive. They told themselves. The rail lines froze. The post was unreliable. But by the following spring, no word had come. They wrote to men in Seward, to the postmasters along the railway, to anyone who might have seen her. What they received back were fragments. A store clerk in Talkeetna remembered her buying a loaf of bread. A homesteader in Nenana swore she had stopped to ask about the river. A conductor recalled a young woman with a notebook, staring out at the forests rushing by. But then nothing. It was as if she had vanished into the wilderness itself. For years, her family carried the weight of that silence. They wondered if she had fallen into a river, if she had been caught in an early storm, if perhaps she had been taken by someone along the road. There were whispers of darker possibilities, of men who traveled those lonely tracks and trails with ill intent. But no proof, no body, no belongings were ever found. Just absence. And then 8 years later, in the summer of 1931, a hunter moving through the backcountry west of the Susitna River stumbled upon something. He had been tracking moose when he found an old weathered satchel tangled in the roots of a fallen spruce. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, was a diary. Its leather cover had darkened with time and moisture, but the name written on the inside front page was still clear. Rebecca, Adams. The news spread quickly through the small communities along the railroad. The diary was passed from hand to hand, until finally it reached the authorities, who carried it south, back to Montana, back to the Adams family. Her mother, by then gray and worn with years of worry, received it with trembling hands. She would not speak for hours, only sitting in her kitchen, the diary pressed against her chest, as though holding the last trace of her daughter, when at last she opened it, the words inside carried Rebecca's voice across the years. The pages told of her journey, of the people she met, the landscapes she described in detail that was almost breathless. But as the entries went on, her words grew. Heavier, stranger. They spoke of a sense of being watched, of hearing things in the forest at night, of figures on the ridgelines that vanished when she tried to follow. The family did not make the diary public. For a long time, it remained with them, read only. By candlelight on certain nights, passed carefully between siblings, grandchildren, and cousins. But the story of Rebecca Adams Young, woman who left for Alaska and never returned, spread through their community and beyond, whispered as both tragedy and mystery. And though nearly a century has passed since she disappeared, her diary still lingers, carrying not just her words, but the haunting feeling that perhaps Alaska had swallowed her, not by accident, but by something older and stranger than anyone could explain. The diary itself was fragile. Its leather cover had cracked in places, and the pages had darkened to the color of old parchment, brittle at the edges. But Rebecca's handwriting was still remarkably clear, looping and careful, almost musical, in its consistency. The first entries spoke of towns she had passed through: Seward, Anchorage, Talkeetna. She wrote of the small cabins that dotted the rail lines, of men who had spent decades in Alaska chasing gold or timber, of women who had arrived with hope in their hearts, but grown weary of frost and isolation early on. Her tone was light, curious, even joyous. She described a summer morning in Seward, when the harbor glittered like a field of tiny diamonds under the sun, how the fishermen brought in salmon so fresh, the air smelled of river and salt at once. She wrote of children playing on snow-melted banks, of families gathered around small stoves, sharing stories over cups of bitter coffee. But as the entries progressed, a subtle shift began. It was the wilderness itself that Rebecca began to notice, the way it pressed upon her, silent yet alive, as if it were waiting. In Denali, she wrote about the vast stretches of spruce and birch, of rivers that cut deep channels through the Al, land of snowdrifts taller than any person she had ever seen. She marveled at it, but she also expressed unease. One entry mentioned a sound she could not name, like whispers in the wind, yet not carried by the wind, that seemed to follow her along the narrow trails by the third month of her journey. Her writing grew urgent. She spoke of the people she met less, and of the landscape more, but always with an undertone of fear. "There are eyes," she wrote, "watching me from behind the trees. At first, I thought it was animals. But no, these eyes are too still, too deliberate. They vanish when I turn." She described nights spent in cabins or tents, listening to strange noises outside, footsteps on snow, the creak of branches snapping, voices that were almost human, but just out of reach. She began sketching them in the margins of her diary. Tall shapes, indistinct, sometimes like men, sometimes not. The sketches were crude, but there was a pattern of figure, always lingering just beyond the firelight. The diary also revealed Rebecca's attempts to understand what she was seeing. She wrote of talking to a trapper in Fairbanks who told her stories of the watchers in the woods, legends passed down from the Athabascans, warnings of things that followed travelers and only revealed themselves to those who were alone. He had laughed when she asked, but in the diary she noted the flicker of fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly when he mimed a shadow moving behind the trees. Her tone alternated between fascination and dread. One night, she wrote of being caught in a blizzard near the Susitna River. The wind was so strong it tore at her clothing, froze her eyelashes into needles of ice. She huddled in a small cabin with only a kerosene lamp, shivering, listening to what she later described as the breathing of the forest, slow and deliberate, almost human. Rebecca's last entries were the most chilling. They were written on a single sheet of paper, torn from the diary, with smudges of dirt and water. In them, she recorded her final days as she tried to make her way to a settlement upriver. She wrote about being lost, the trees unfamiliar, the trails vanishing under fresh snow. She mentioned hunger, exhaustion, and a growing sense that she was no longer alone. "They are always just behind me," she wrote. "I see their shadows when the sun sets. I hear whispers in the trees at night. I do not think I can escape them." Her handwriting became erratic. Words were crossed out, sentences abandoned, mid-thought. Yet she continued writing, compelled as if by some force outside herself. "I cannot tell if this is reality, or if the forest is changing me. The river I follow twists, the mountains move, and the sun does not rise as it should. I am afraid, but I must keep moving. I must." The last page stopped there. No signature, no closing. The words ended mid-sentence, like a door that had slammed shut behind her dot when her family read these entries. They were struck by two things. First, by how alive she had been in her observations of the land and its people, and second, by the profound terror that seemed to have taken hold of her. Scholars who later examined the diary suggested that she may have suffered from hypothermia, isolation, or even hallucinations caused by the harsh conditions. But those who knew Rebecca believed she had written the truth as she experienced it: fear, wonder, and a sense of being hunted by something unseen. For the local communities near where the diary was found, stories quickly grew. Hunters, trappers, and even railroad workers began sharing tales of seeing figures in the trees or lights moving where no cabin should exist. Some claimed they heard voices on nights when the wind howled, voices calling names of travelers long gone. Many dismissed these as folklore, the natural exaggeration that comes with long winters and endless forests. Others could not explain what they saw, insisting that Rebecca Adams' warnings had been real. The diary became more than a personal record. It became a map of human fragility in the face of a land that was at once breathtaking and merciless. Rebecca's words captured the raw beauty of Alaska, but also its power to unsettle, to isolate, and to erase a person if they wandered too far from safety. By the time the diary was recovered, 8 years after her disappearance, Rebecca Adams had become a legend in her own right. Some viewed her as a brave pioneer, a writer who sought to understand a wild land. Others feared that she had stumbled into a space where the ordinary rules of life did not apply, and that what she had encountered was a mystery beyond comprehension. Her family, however, never stopped mourning. They clung to the diary as both a comfort and a torment, proof that she had existed, proof of the life she had tried to live, but also proof of the unspeakable end that had likely come to her. The diary never provided answers about what actually happened, only the traces of a young woman's courage and her final, haunting observations of a wilderness that could claim anyone who ventured too far into its folds. And as the years passed, people who read the diary felt the same shiver Rebecca had described, the sense that somewhere, deep in Alaska, the shadows were waiting. Waiting not just for her, but for anyone who might wander too far into the unknown, seeking adventure, seeking story, seeking life, and finding something else entirely. After the discovery of Rebecca Adams' diary, her family could no longer remain passive. For 8 years, they had clung to hope and despair in equal measure, imagining the harsh Alaskan wilderness swallowing her whole, or less plausibly, that she had found some hidden refuge. Now, With her own words in their hands, they felt compelled to act. They contacted local authorities, trappers, and railroad workers, hoping to retrace her journey, to find even the smallest clue that might explain what had happened. A small search party was organized in the summer of 1932. Among them was John Adams, Rebecca's older brother, a sturdy man who had spent his life working the Montana plains. He knew survival in rough country, but Alaska was different, its forests deep and endless, its rivers powerful, and its mountains towering like walls that could crush a person's spirit as quickly as any storm. Still, he was determined. He carried with him his sister's diary, hoping that her own descriptions could guide him. The search followed the tracks she had reportedly taken along the Alaska Railroad, from Seward to Talkeetna, and then upriver toward Denali and the Susitna River. They visited towns she had mentioned, asking elderly residents if they remembered a young woman traveling alone nearly a decade before. Most shook their heads. Time had erased her from memory. Yet here and there, they found traces. A cabin where a fur trapper recalled a solitary woman who had asked strange questions. A riverbank where hunters remembered finding a leather notebook that had since disappeared, and the occasional railroad worker who remembered glimpsing a figure in the distance, moving against the wind as if she were part of the land itself. As John and the small group moved deeper into the wilderness, the environment itself seemed to push back. Snowfields lingered into summer, rivers swelled with ice melt, and fog clung to the hills in thick rolling waves. Animals appeared and disappeared without sound. Tracks in the snow suggested the presence of people, or something like people. Whenever they followed them, the prints led only to rocks, trees, or the river. No sign of Rebecca, no trace of her camp, no clues to the final days recorded in her diary. The diary guided them with both clarity and confusion. Rebecca had written about fords and rivers, small fishing villages, and landmarks along the mountains. Yet when the search party arrived at these locations, they often found the geography altered. Streams had shifted, snow had melted or piled anew, trees had fallen in ways that obscured trails she had once used. It was as if the land itself had changed over the years, or perhaps, as she had written, something had shifted around her. Then came the most unsettling discoveries. Near a bend of the Susitna River, the searchers found strange markings on tree lines, scratched into bark, symbols that seemed deliberate but indecipherable. John remembered her diary entries about shapes in the trees, and for the first time, he began to feel that what she had written might not have been hallucinations or fear, but warnings. They were not alone. Not the kind of presence one could see easily, but something that observed. That watch. One evening, after a day of hiking through dense spruce and birch, the party made camp near a small clearing. The wind rose suddenly, and John noticed shadows, moving in a way that did not align with the trees. He called the others' attention, but by the time they looked, nothing remained. Only the whispering of wind through needles, and the heavy stillness of the forest. That night, he read aloud portions of Rebecca's diary by the fire. Her descriptions of footsteps outside cabins, voices in the trees, and fleeting figures seemed to resonate with the very sounds of the wilderness around them. The men sat in silence, uneasy, listening to the wind, wondering if they were experiencing the same thing that had terrified Rebecca. Days passed. The search party combed the banks of the river, climbed ridges, and inspected abandoned cabins. They found personal items scattered by previous travelers. A tin cup, a frayed blanket, a worn-out boot, but nothing that belonged specifically to Rebecca. Each night, the wilderness seemed to close around them, and a sense of being observed persisted. Hunters later described it as a heavy feeling, as though the forest itself had a pulse, a consciousness aware of intruders. John began to fear that perhaps his sister had stumbled too far, that she had walked into a place where humans did not belong. Then, Near a series of snow-melted caves along a ridge, they found something that sent chills down their spines. Inside one of the caves, partially hidden by fallen rocks, were pages torn from a notebook, weathered but unmistakably in Rebecca's handwriting. The entries were short, fragmented, almost frantic. She wrote about shadows moving against the sun, shapes forming and dissolving in fog, voices calling her name. She had made sketches, more vivid and grotesque than anything in her diary, of figures with elongated limbs and staring eyes, crouching at the edge of the forest. John traced the sketches with his finger, feeling a deep unease. She saw them. He whispered. She wasn't imagining it. The others nodded, though none spoke. They packed the pages carefully, knowing that the evidence they held was incomplete, but undeniable. Rebecca Adams had experienced something extraordinary and terrifying, something the searchers could not fully explain. The party eventually returned to civilization, empty-handed in terms of locating her body. The land had kept its secret. Yet the fragments they brought back, the diary, the sketches, the pages, became a testament to her courage and to the relentless power of Alaska. Newspapers reported the discovery, and townspeople debated whether the wilderness had driven her mad or whether she had truly witnessed something beyond ordinary understanding. The mystery became part of local legend. Some hunters avoided the ridge where her last pages were found, claiming that the air itself felt wrong. Others insisted that the land was neutral, that Rebecca had simply been caught in isolation and misfortune. Over time, however, a pattern of accounts emerged. Travelers along the same trails began reporting figures glimpsed in the distance, lights flickering where no cabin existed, sounds of footsteps on snow-covered ridges. In some cases, traces of items, books, pencils, or scraps of paper would appear, seemingly dropped by no one. Though Rebecca Adams' story had begun as a personal tragedy, it had become something more, a cautionary tale of the wilderness, a reminder of how human presence is fleeting against the vast, indifferent backdrop of Alaska. Her family never stopped searching. John returned several times, each trip ending in frustration, fatigue, and the persistent unease of the forest's gaze. Yet each time he left, he carried with him the diary and the fragments, as though by holding them he could maintain a connection to Rebecca. The mystery endured, gnawing at the edges of his mind, leaving him with questions he knew would never be answered. By the late 1930s, Rebecca Adams' name was known along the railroads and small towns of Alaska. She became a figure both admired and feared, a young woman who had dared to explore, to observe, to write, and who had vanished into a land that many considered sacred, untouchable, and sometimes perilous beyond imagination. The diary was studied, copied, and eventually shared with historians. But no explanation emerged for her disappearance, and no one could account for the phenomena she had recorded. It was in this uneasy silence that her story settled into the cultural memory of the region, a tale of courage, mystery, and the kind of wilderness so vast and unknowable that it could erase a person without a trace, leaving only words, sketches, and whispers in the wind. The years turned slowly for the Adams family. They aged in the rhythm of hope and sorrow, each day marked by the absence of Rebecca. The diary and the fragments from her journey became sacred objects, held with reverence and fear. Visitors would come to see them, historians, writers, travelers, but none could fully understand the weight of what the family carried. The sense of a daughter and sister, lost not to ordinary fate, but to a wilderness that defied logic, that seemed almost alive. The legend of Rebecca Adams grew over time. Her story was told in hushed tones around fireplaces, in schools, in small-town newspapers. People recounted the young woman who had ventured alone into the Alaskan wilds, whose curiosity and courage were unparalleled, yet who vanished as though the land itself had claimed her. Parents used her story to caution children, hikers to warn travelers, and writers to imagine the raw terror and beauty of a frontier that could inspire awe and fear in equal measure. But for those who had held her diary, who had touched the pages, stained with water and dirt, the story was far more intimate. They read not just about the landscapes, rivers, and mountains of Alaska, but about Rebecca herself, her thoughts, her fears, her astonishment at the vastness of the world. Through her words, they could feel the shiver of a midnight wind, the crunch of snow beneath frozen boots, and the terrifying silence of trees that seemed to watch. The diary was more than a record. It was a bridge to a life abruptly interrupted. Decades passed, and the world changed. Railroads gave way to highways, towns expanded, and Alaska began to modernize. Yet the wilderness Rebecca had walked remained, in many ways unchanged, stubborn, indifferent. The forests, rivers, and mountains held their secrets tightly. Hikers and trappers continued to report strange sounds, shadows that moved without explanation, lights in empty clearings. Many dismissed these accounts as imagination, but others believed that the land had its own memory, that it had recorded Rebecca's passage, and perhaps the passage of others who had dared to wander too far. Historians who later studied the diary speculated on its contents. Some suggested that hypothermia or malnutrition might have caused hallucinations, that isolation could twist perception. Others considered the cultural context of her encounters, particularly the stories she had noted from local Alaskan peoples, about spirits or watchers in the forest. Yet none could explain the consistent patterns in her sketches, the repeated mentions of figures that moved with intention, the symbols scratched into trees where she had been. There were questions without answers, mysteries that refused to yield dot for the Adams family. The diary became a testament not only to Rebecca's life, but also to her bravery. They learned to read between the lines, to see the curiosity, the intelligence, and the unflinching courage that had defined her journey. She had faced a world that was untamed, that could inspire wonder, but also exact a terrible cost. Her disappearance became a symbol, a haunting reminder of the limits of human control in the face of nature, and of the thin line between adventure and peril. Visitors to Montana, decades later, still asked to see the diary. They would sit quietly as family members turned the pages, the smell of old paper filling the air, the scratches and smudges of time a palpable presence. And in those quiet moments, one could almost hear Rebecca's voice, soft, curious, fearful, alive, whispering from across the years. Though her body was never found, and though no one could definitively explain what had happened to her, Rebecca Adams' story endured. It endured because of her words, because of her courage, and because of the eerie possibility that Alaska had claimed her not out of malice, but as a witness to something far older than anyone could understand. She became a figure of legend, a reminder that some places are not meant to be tamed, and that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Her diary, preserved through decades, became an artifact of both history and legend. Scholars, writers, and travelers who came after her read it and felt the same mix of awe and fear. They imagined her footsteps on snow, her breath rising in the cold morning air, her eyes scanning forests that could swallow a person whole. And when they closed the diary, they carried with them the undeniable impression that Rebecca Adams' journey was not just a tale of disappearance, but a reflection of the human spirit confronting the immense and unknowable. In the end, her story remains as haunting as the Alaskan wilderness itself. It is a story of courage, curiosity, and a confrontation with the unknown, a young woman who ventured alone into a land larger and more mysterious than she could have imagined, who recorded her journey with honesty and bravery, and who vanished, leaving only whispers, shadows, and the words that survived her. The forest continues to stand, unchanged in its vastness. Rivers carve their way through the mountains. Snow drifts and fog roll over ridges. And somewhere in the midst of that wilderness, one can imagine Rebecca Adams walking still, pen in hand, documenting what she sees, unheard by anyone but the trees, the wind, and the timeless land that kept her secret. Her story is a warning, a memorial, and a legend all at once. And as people continue to explore the Alaskan wilderness, they carry with them the knowledge that Rebecca Adams once walked. There, alone, brave, and watchful, and that the world she encountered is not entirely ours to understand.